This is kind of the panel I've been looking forward to. I think there's just a lot of interesting implications with this new on-demand economy, and I think we're going to explore some of them on this next panel. So yeah, let's jump right into it. I'm going to welcome Kim Mai Cutler from TechCrunch up on stage, and she will introduce the panelists. Kim Mai.
Okay, so we have the most abstract conceptual name for a panel. It's called Below the API Divide. I think Misha's intent is to really talk about the relationship between workers and some of these large on-demand platform companies. So do you want to just do, like we have Nick from Shuttle, do you guys want to just say quickly like a sentence or two about what you guys do?
Sure, I got my.
Okay, guys, everyone has their own mic. I can copy here.
Yeah, below the API divide, I had to ask what that was. Not the right panel?
No, wait.
So Shuttle is transportation for busy families. So let's say you have 3 kids. One's got ballet, and one's got baseball, and one wants to go to a friend's house, and you've got work. It's what do you do? Well, Shuttle uses trusted caregivers to give safe transportation to your child or your senior.
Okay. And Dan, you were on stage a little bit earlier, but maybe we have people who filed in.
Yeah, so I'm Dan, co-founder of Managed by Q. We provide technology-enabled office services. So we're building an operating system for built environments to make it easy to run in space.
Selena, founder of Playbook HR, recently joined Intuit. We help provide operations management for companies with on-demand workforces, compliance, taxes, all of that.
Okay, so the first question I want to ask is, some companies choose to do 1099s with their contractors, and some choose to do W-2. Why either? And what's kind of the decision-making matrix that goes into that? Maybe do you want to start and give me kind of an overview, and then you guys have 2 different strategies, so we can talk about why you made the decisions that you did.
Yeah. We work with companies that have both, so people that just have 1099 workers and also those with W-2. The process for onboarding, tracking, and the types of analytics people need are pretty much the same. There are some nuances about both in terms of what tax documents to collect, but we are pretty agnostic, but we have some companies that do one or the other, not both.
Does it feel, how intentional does it feel, or how arbitrary does it feel when a company starts out and makes that decision about 1099ing their workers?
Usually the companies will have already decided or have a sense of which route they want to go down. But the majority, I would say, are 1099. I think it's mainly for business reasons that...
Business reasons like?
Save money on costs, and it takes longer to onboard someone who's W-2, more documents that need to be filled, insurance that needs to be filled out. With 1099, you just need a contractor agreement and everything. Certain pieces of document for insurance, and then you can get them working as soon as something comes back clear.
So,
well,
yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily just a question of cost. That's not necessarily like the main driver. So, I mean, for us, the decision to go with contractors is really like the nature of the work. How much do we have? What kind of flexibility do we want to offer? What kind of flexibility is needed to make the system work as a whole? So, for us, having full-time employees just doesn't work. We couldn't offer the service.
You were saying backstage, like when you actually think about the nature of shuttle drivers, like especially in a suburban area, you don't have the density to sustain enough rides per hour, so you'll have, like a driver for like a 5 or 15-minute ride and then off. That's what you're saying earlier?
Yeah. So I mean, for instance, a lot of the activity that we do are in suburban environments. So Walnut Creek or Pleasanton, and many of the rides that we give are, a teacher giving a handful of kids a ride to school in the morning. That's not necessarily a full-time operation. That's 5 minutes or so. And so we need that flexibility for the people who drive for our service to come on and off the platform. And it's also, they want the flexibility too. Like most of the people have other jobs as well or other activities. And so we're not prescribing like, okay, you have to drive this person here, you have to work this many hours. You know, on average, drivers give a handful of rides a day, and that's it. And so,
I mean, if you had a W-2 structure, your business basically wouldn't work at all.
it would not work.
Okay. Dan, you chose a different route. You hired your employees full time.
I mean, I think to your earlier question, like Nick's point is pretty valid. It's more about figuring out like what is the flavor of work that you need, and then figuring out what regulatory framework is most appropriate. So unless like as a company you're deliberately being cute with regulation, like you have to think like you need to hire people, like you need to train them, you need to tell them when to be somewhere, like all the things that you can do when you have employees, and then you make a decision. And that was how we arrived at it. I think Nick's point is pretty fair around the scheduling. Our answer to that is, well, we need to build up enough throughput to be able to utilize people, and then we have like a pretty built model to look at what's our utilization of our operators. So how many hours do they want to be working a week? How many hours do we need them to work a week for it to make sense for us to employ them? And then like how effectively they utilized, and we use that to model as we scale, as we add more operators to the system. Keep a very close eye on utilization because that's the only way that it can work.
How much do you both end up, like, between your model, how much do your workers earn per hour?
So our operators for the cleaning, which is the lowest paid, they start at $12.50 an hour plus benefits.
Okay, and then what's your median take home usually?
It really depends. So let me give kind of two examples. I'll take the, driving from, let's say, 3 in the afternoon till 5 in the afternoon, which is like our busiest time. We can string a lot of rides together in those times, especially in San Francisco. And those people, they're making $40, $50, $60 an hour in some cases.
But just for those 2 hours?
Yeah, whereas, I mean, today, I think we have very few rides in the middle of the day. So
right.
You're not making any, right? So it really depends on the time of day and sort of the density of where you are. If you take just the driving time, it's almost over $50 an hour that people are making. But you have to like lump in some of this downtime, right? So I'd love to give like a specific number, but it's actually really hard to get at, and it varies widely.
One thing that other CEOs of on-demand companies have told me is that like between the two, between 1099 and the W-2, there needs to be some type of third employment structure.
Yeah.
What is that, and what would that look like?
Well, if you look at how a lot of this is in the courts right now.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
And should it be like, that's another question, should it be done through a legislative model, or should it be done through the courts and the judiciary system?
well, I think what the courts are saying is like, as a reasonable person, I could say, here's 5 things that this company does that makes this person a contractor. Here's 5 things that this company does that makes this person an employee. Like, any reasonable person cannot necessarily make the decision. And, I mean, even for us, like, we're required to do things that push us more into the employer category in some cases.
Yeah.
For instance, we have to put branding on the vehicles. And that would fall into, okay, well, that looks more like an employee. But then we don't require you to even work. Like, you don't have to show up for work if you don't want. And that's clearly in the contract.
Yeah.
So another category totally makes sense. And I think it would be a disservice if the courts or the legislature tried to push what we do and some of the other companies into one of these 2 boxes. They just don't work.
Do you agree with that, Selena?
No, this is something we talked about as well.
Yeah.
It's something that we agree on, and Intuit as a whole, being tightly knit with regulators, are going in front of Congress every month talking about some of the data we've collected about how many jobs each contractor has been taking, how much they're making, figuring out what type of system this could be if there was this third class.
What do you think a smart way to design it would be?
I think there's different ways to look at it. Again, like Nick was saying, there are certain things that, like training or branding, that technically classify you as an employee. But there are things that these companies do in order to maintain certain quality and brand awareness that don't necessarily make them exactly full-time employees. But something like that, floors on income, I know that's something that's been discussed.
How do the both of you make sure that a lot of you're like very sensitive to the needs of your like contractors or workers? Because for example, like sometimes like Postmates in a very famous example made some interface changes that drastically reduced tips, and that was bad for the workers and ultimately probably bad for the company. Like, how do you prevent a situation like that?
Oh, well, I mean, I think bad for the company is sort of, yes, it's bad for the worker too, but we all want to make decisions that keep this workforce happy.
Yeah.
It's costly. I mean, we run significant amounts of background checks on people. We're constantly doing that. Like, these ongoing costs to retain drivers and to bring them onto the system are like pretty serious. And so every time we churn out a driver, whether it's because they don't want to do that kind of work anymore, or we made a change that kind of forces them to get out.
Yeah.
Well, that's super expensive. So it's really, when we do things, we're talking to our drivers, we're looking at the cost imposed on us, what the cost will be on them, and getting feedback and trying to be really balanced about it. Because in these types of marketplaces, you need the supply and you need the demand, and they're not going to work if one of them is just inhibited in some way. So you got to find that balance.
What about you? I mean, they actually work for you, so it's different.
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of them. I mean, we have, one of the things we do is like we go out of our way to build a community, and like part of our thinking is that we actually, over time, reduce supervisory overhead by creating community where people are engaging with each other rather than needing to like talk to a supervisor. And so, I mean, that's one way. So we have an operator assembly every month, and so and this is in every city where all the operators come together, and there's updates about the company, and they talk about any pressing questions, ideas. But we also now just built into the app the ability for operators to tell us when they have an idea. And one of the things that happens in service companies, or can happen in service companies, is operational decisions get very disconnected from the reality of what's actually going on in the field. And so we found that the best ideas for process improvement and for changes to the app actually come from our operators. So we actually built a workflow directly into the app from the help center, where as easy as they could tell us that the dishwasher's not working, they could tell us that they think that we should reroute the tasks in a certain way. And we're building out a workflow now where all those ideas are vetted and categorized and are made public to our entire team, which is now like hundreds of people, so that they can see that we're actually working towards these ideas. But it also just makes it a better job for them.
Yeah.
They're part of innovation. We want to be the most innovative service company in the world. We can't expect that I can sit in an office and innovate on the service we're delivering.
You also were saying earlier that you kind of design the jobs and the locations that are the jobs around where they actually live, so it's convenient for them, like from a transportation perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that's like part of our, delivering on our promise of being a good employer and creating good jobs, is being thoughtful about, the realities of the lives of the folks that work for us. And so one of the things we try and do kind of almost as like an ethnography is think about what do they do when they're not working, and obviously like when they're not working, they're home. And so when we schedule them for shifts, we're actually taking into account where do they live and what subway lines do they use. And so we're actually using Google Maps API to actually figure out the best routes for them in travel time, and now the operator app tells them which subway to take. Because in New York, everyone's
What are the best practices you've seen from some of the companies that you work with on just keeping connected with their worker contractor bases?
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the things we've seen is having, in terms of staying in touch with folks that you're training, bringing on new folks, you can have more experience, whether it be delivery agents running mentorship programs with the people who are just starting out. So we've seen that been pretty successful so far with some of the companies. Further down the line, we've seen companies try to roll out things like perks, discounts, even momentum program with Accelerate. They're all trying to provide things that you would get normally as a real full-time employee, as a part-time employee, but also roll it out for the contractors. So that's some of the things, programs we've seen put together for this.
I think it's also kind of how do you view this workforce. I mean, in many ways, like our drivers are our customers as well. It kind of goes back to the marketplace piece. Like, it doesn't work with one without the other. And we do a lot of things, whether it's bringing them all together, supporting them through online communities, and we look at them as customers as well.
One of the interesting pieces of feedback that I've got from a lot of on-demand companies is that the biggest constraint right now is on the supply of labor side, not on the consumer demand side. And if you look at we've had a really strong jobs report, our unemployment numbers I think is like around 5.4% in the U.S. But I wonder what happens when the macroeconomic cycle changes and what that does to the relationship between these platforms and workers. does that, the dynamic